Do you want to know what they whispered? The twins, the Morrison girls, those 9-year-old sisters from Kentucky in 1834. They leaned into the ear of a grieving widow on the second night of their stay and told her where her husband's body was buried, not where it was supposed to be, where it truly was, his bones hidden deep in the river bend under a fallen sycamore. And when the men of Pine Hollow dug there the next morning, they found him, exactly as the girls had said. Now tell me, where are you watching from right now, and what time is it where you are? Because if you're here, listening to me, this story has already chosen you. The old record begins with silence, the kind of silence you don't find anymore. Pastor William Phillips had a habit of describing not just what was said, but how the air in the room shifted. He wrote that when Rebecca and Rachel entered his church for the first time, the congregation's chatter collapsed like it had been swallowed. Their tiny feet left no sound on the wooden floor. He noticed it, and he noted it, because silence in a church is usually reverent. But this silence was different. It was as though everyone felt all at once that something had intruded, a presence cloaked in innocence. Their father, Ezekiel Morrison, stood tall but withered, his eyes hollowed from miles of travel and years of grief. He carried scripture in his satchel, but he carried something else in his daughters, something that did not belong to him, nor to this world. His wife had died bringing them into it, and men like Ezekiel often believed such things marked a child forever. Pastor Phillips did not believe in superstition. He believed in God, in records, in discipline, but still, he could not stop writing the word strange again and again in his journal that winter. The congregation at Pine Hollow was small, tight-knit, weary of outsiders, but on that November evening, the children unsettled everyone. Rebecca smiled too much for a girl who had walked through cold mud for miles. Rachel hardly spoke at all, yet when her sister did, Rachel's lips moved slightly, echoing words half a second before they were spoken aloud. And then came the first revelation. Over bread and soup at the parsonage table, Rebecca turned to Mrs. Phillips and asked about the roses by the eastern fence. The roses no outsider could possibly know about. The roses that had nearly been destroyed by blight 3 summers past, long before the girls had ever stepped into that valley. Mrs. Phillips froze, spoon in hand. She had never spoken of the roses to anyone but her husband. That was only the beginning. The next morning, a farmer's boy approached Rachel with a toy carved from hickory. She touched it, tilted her head, and whispered, "You're going to break your arm when the frost comes." The boy laughed. By nightfall, he was screaming in agony, his arm snapped clean in two after slipping on black ice. Pastor Phillips recorded the exact words. No hesitation, no chance for coincidence. 9 years old, and already predicting suffering as if they had lived the future themselves. The pastor tried to find comfort in scripture, but the words felt hollow. He confessed in his journal that he had begun to doubt, not God exactly, but the boundaries of the natural order. If children could see the secrets of the past and the shadows of the future, what did that mean for free will, for prayer, for faith? Were they chosen or cursed? The town would soon learn that every word the twins spoke carried weight, sometimes prophecy, sometimes confession, sometimes knowledge buried with the dead, and once spoken, it could not be taken back. Once revealed, it demanded proof, and proof always came, no matter how terrible. Do you see what I mean? We were never meant to this story. Yet here you are, listening, and I'm not sure if you'll ever leave unchanged. The second night was colder. Frost clung to the inside of the parsonage windows, and the congregation had dwindled to a handful of faithful souls huddled close to the stove. It should have been ordinary, another night of prayer, another sermon to weary frontier people. But the twins shifted the air again. Rebecca sat in the front pew, hands folded too neatly, eyes unblinking. Rachel sat beside her, shoulders drawn tight, staring at the wooden floor as if it concealed something writhing beneath. When Pastor Phillips opened his Bible, Rebecca spoke before he could utter a word. "Don't choose that verse. Choose Jonah chapter 2. That's where the truth is tonight." Phillips, stunned, looked down. He had not spoken of his intended passage to anyone. And when he opened Jonah, his eyes fell on the prayer from the belly of the fish, words of entrapment, despair, and miraculous survival. The verse struck him like a hammer. Years later, he admitted in his journal that at that moment, he felt as if the sermon had been chosen not by him, not even by God, but by the mouth of a child who should not have known. After the service, the whispers began. Congregants lingered in the dark outside the church, their breath forming clouds that seemed to thicken the night. Which children? some said under their breath. Others insisted it was the Lord working through them. But the fear was stronger than the faith. Pine Hollow was too small, too isolated to tolerate uncertainty. When something new appeared, it was either divine or it was damnation. No middle ground. That night, the widow Sarah Collins approached the girls. Her husband had vanished months before, supposedly lost to the wilderness. His body never recovered. She asked Rebecca if she knew where he rested. The child's face shifted, not pity, not cruelty, but something sharper, as if knowledge itself was a burden pressing through her small frame. Under the tree by the bend of the river, Rebecca whispered. His mouth is full of dirt. Rachel repeated the words at the exact same time, their voices twined like a single echo. Sarah collapsed, wailing, and the room filled with dread. Men were sent the next morning, axes in hand. They cut through the frozen soil beneath the sycamore, the one marked by flood and age, and there he was. Bones curled, jaw stuffed with mud, just as the twins had said. When the news spread, the town changed. No longer were they Ezekiel's daughters. They became something else, portals perhaps, or omens. Everyone wanted answers, but no one wanted to stand too close. Ezekiel himself seemed torn between pride and terror. He kept his daughters close, refused to let them wander without him. In his journal, Pastor Phillips described one chilling moment, Ezekiel gripping Rebecca's arm too tightly, hissing at her not to speak. She only smiled and whispered back, "I can't stop, you know that." He released her as if burned. By the third day, Phillips confessed his dreams had turned foul. He saw the twins wandering the church at night, hands brushing the pews, eyes black with knowledge that belonged to no man. He saw them standing by his bedside, mouthing words he could not hear but could feel crawling inside his skull. He woke gasping, convinced that even his thoughts were no longer his own. I wonder, as you hear this now, if you feel it too, that sense of a veil being pulled back. That trembling knowledge that once a truth is revealed, you cannot unhear it. Do you feel safer knowing, or do you already wish you could look away? Because the people of Pine Hollow had no choice. The girls spoke, the earth answered, and death itself obeyed their voices. By the third evening, the church no longer felt like a sanctuary. The wooden walls seemed to close in tighter, the fire in the stove sputtered as if suffocated by an unseen hand, and every eye in Pine Hollow watched the twins with a mixture of reverence and horror. Some came to them openly, desperate for truth. Others came with clenched jaws, hoping to prove them liars, but no one could leave untouched. Rebecca sat near the altar, humming a tune no one recognized, though a few swore later it was older than the hymns themselves. Rachel leaned against her sister's shoulder, eyes distant, as if seeing through the room into something only she could perceive. A farmer's wife asked if her child, sick with fever, would live until spring. Rebecca smiled faintly, tilted her head, and said, "Yes, but your second child will not." The woman paled, clutching her belly, though she had not told anyone yet that she was with child again. The room fell silent. Then came the most disturbing moment yet. Pastor Phillips was about to close the service when Rachel finally spoke on her own, her voice brittle, unused. "You will die in 13 years, on a Sunday, not in this church, but in another, one made of stone." She was staring directly at him, her pale face unreadable. He froze, his mouth dry, his hands trembling over the Bible. Ezekiel's voice cut sharp through the silence. "Enough." But Rachel only blinked and whispered, "I saw it." Phillips confessed in his journal that he tried to dismiss it. He told himself children imagine things, that grief and fatigue clouded his reason, but deep inside he felt the weight of prophecy settle upon him like chains. He counted forward in his mind, 13 years from that night, and could not stop himself. From then on, every sermon he gave carried a shadow behind it. Every Sunday was marked in his soul. That night, the congregation's unity fractured. Some declared the girls saints, gifted by God to bring hidden truth into light. Others accused Ezekiel of harboring witchcraft, his daughters cursed and dangerous. A few whispered of banishing them outright, but fear held their tongues. Because how do you confront a child who already knows the outcome? How do you fight against the certainty of their words? The next day, a man named Samuel Wright stormed into the churchyard, demanding proof. His brother had disappeared 5 years earlier in a logging accident. No body had ever been recovered. He spat at the ground, calling the twins liars, daring them to speak. Rebecca's smile faded for the first time. She looked at him with eyes far too old for her face and said, "He didn't drown in the river like you were told. He was buried alive beneath the timber. You heard him cry, but you thought it was the wind." Samuel's face twisted with rage. He lunged, hand raised to strike but stopped short, as if something invisible gripped him. His arm trembled in the air, veins bulging, his breath caught in his throat. The congregation pulled him away, but the damage was done. Every man and woman there swore they heard a faint echo of screaming, like muffled cries trapped beneath the very earth. Phillips wrote only 2 words to describe that night: no escape. He began to realize the twins weren't simply revealing knowledge. They were reshaping the town, dismantling belief, leaving no man's conscience untouched. Truth was no longer something you sought, it was something that hunted you. And now, as I pass this truth to you, I must ask, are you ready to keep going? Because the next part of this story is where the veil truly begins to tear. On the 4th day, the town stopped pretending life was ordinary. Work slowed, fields were left untended, men lingered by the church, pretending to mend fences or haul water, but really they were waiting for the twins to speak again, waiting for the next revelation to crash through their lives like a storm they couldn't avoid. The twins did not ask for this attention, yet they seemed to feed on it, as if every frightened glance only made their voices steadier, their visions clearer. That morning, Rebecca walked into the church alone. Her father and sister were still in the parsonage, but she moved with purpose, small footsteps echoing against the wooden floorboards. She approached the pulpit, placed her hands on it, and whispered a single sentence: "There are bones beneath this place." Pastor Phillips froze where he stood. The church had been built by their own hands, every plank of timber carried from the hills. No one had ever spoken of graves, yet Rebecca's tone was calm, certain. "Not men of Pine Hollow," she added softly, "but those who came before." The pastor did not want to believe her, but fear drove him to dig. By evening, men had pried up the floorboards near the altar. What they uncovered was not 1 skeleton but 3, not settlers, but older remains, their skulls fractured, their bones arranged in a circle like some forgotten ritual had sealed them there. The discovery sent shockwaves through the congregation. Was the church built on cursed ground? Had they been worshipping all these years over the remnants of blood sacrifice? Ezekiel tried to contain it. He told the men to stop digging, that disturbing the dead would bring no good, but the whispers had already spread. Whispers that the twins were not revealing truth, but awakening it. That the church had not chosen to host the Morrisons. It had been waiting for them. That night, Rebecca and Rachel spoke in tandem for the first time. They sat side by side in the flickering lamplight, their voices weaving together, impossible to tell apart. "You are not the first," they said. "Others came before, others prayed here, but they did not pray to your God." The words chilled the room. Ezekiel's face blanched. Pastor Phillips nearly dropped his pen as he wrote furiously to capture every syllable. The twins rocked slightly as they spoke, as though listening to something distant, something beneath the floor, guiding them. When they fell silent, the church felt heavier, like the walls themselves were sagging under the weight of unseen eyes. Some of the women began to weep. Men stood rigid, jaws clenched, but none dared speak. It was as if the town itself had been put on trial. Their faith weighed against truths they could neither explain nor escape. Later, Phillips wrote that he caught Ezekiel outside, gripping his satchel, whispering to himself. The preacher's eyes darted wildly, and when he noticed Phillips, he muttered, "They weren't supposed to say it, they weren't supposed to tell." It was the first time Phillips realized that Ezekiel might not just be a grieving father. He might be a man carrying a secret of his own, one bound up in his daughter's uncanny gift, or curse. As the fire dimmed that night, the pastor admitted he no longer knew what he feared more, that the twins were possessed by something beyond human understanding, or that they were simply telling the truth, and the truth itself was the horror. And here's where I ask you, what do you feel crawling inside your own thoughts right now? Because truth is not neutral, it reshapes, it devours, and what the Morrison twins were about to reveal next would change Pine Hollow forever. By the 5th night, fear had hardened into obsession. The people of Pine Hollow no longer avoided the twins. They sought them out, unable to resist the terrible hunger for answers. Men who had lost livestock, women who mourned miscarriages, children who had nightmares they could not explain, all crowded the small parsonage or loitered near the churchyard, waiting for the girls to speak. It was no longer worship, it was dependence. They did not pray to God for revelation, they listened for the voices of 9-year-old children. That evening, Rebecca and Rachel were invited into a gathering of elders. They sat at the long table, their tiny hands folded, as men decades older leaned forward, eyes hollow with expectation. A silence stretched too long, broken only when Rachel whispered, "There is rot in your houses." A murmur rose, but Rebecca's voice cut sharp. "Not the wood, not the walls, the men." Her gaze landed on Samuel Wright, the same man who had tried to strike her days before. She tilted her head, eyes narrowing, and said, "You killed your brother, not the river, you." The room erupted. Samuel leapt to his feet, shouting, cursing, but the elders dragged him down. He screamed denial, but Rebecca spoke over him, her tone flat, merciless. "You trapped him beneath the logs, you heard him beg, you left him." The men exchanged dark looks. For years, rumors had lingered about Samuel's jealousy, his brother inheriting more land. But no proof had ever surfaced. Now, in the trembling voice of a child, the accusation became truth. Samuel's wife collapsed into sobs. His sons fled the church. The town split further, half demanding punishment, half demanding silence. But no one could unhear it. For the first time, Rebecca had not only revealed knowledge of the dead, she had exposed the living. Ezekiel's face twisted with torment. He grabbed both daughters by their shoulders afterward, his voice shaking with fury and dread. "You don't understand what you're playing with," he hissed, but Rachel only looked at him with a gaze too ancient for her years and said, "We're not playing, Father, we're remembering." That night, Pastor Phillips could not sleep. He described in his journal a recurring sound, knuckles rapping softly against his door, though no one was there when he opened it. He feared he was losing his mind, but then he found his ink well tipped over. Black stains spread across the page of scripture he had left open. Jonah, chapter 2, the same verse Rebecca had chosen days before. He began to wonder if the girls were not merely gifted, but if something moved through them, something searching for vessels. The town was unraveling. Neighbors looked at each other with suspicion, wondering whose sins would be dragged into the open next. Husbands stared at wives, wives at husbands, children at parents, all with the same haunted thought. What do the twins know about me? And yet, they kept coming back. Because the human heart is a fragile thing. It would rather tremble before horror than remain blind. Every man and woman in Pine Hollow wanted the terrible gift turned on them, if only to know. Do you feel it too? That pull, the urge to demand what they might say about you if they were here right now? Careful, curiosity was the rope that dragged Pine Hollow deeper into the pit, and soon that rope would tighten into a noose. By the 6th day, Pine Hollow had transformed. The settlement no longer functioned as a village but as a shrine to the Morrison twins. The church bell rang not for worship but for gathering whenever the girls spoke. The pastor's authority was stripped, Ezekiel's sermons ignored. All eyes turned to the twins, waiting for their next revelation. Truth had become their idol, no matter how brutal, and the people bowed before it. That morning, Rebecca stood at the altar and announced, "There will be fire." No explanation, no detail, just fire. The crowd gasped, hands clutched to mouths, and murmurs filled the air. Within hours, word spread that the barn of a local farmer had caught flame, reducing livestock and harvest to ash. When the smoke cleared, the townsfolk stared at the girls not with suspicion, but awe. Prophecy had become proof. Their voices carried the weight of inevitability. Rachel, however, had grown quieter, more withdrawn. She rarely spoke unless her sister began first, as though she were listening to something deeper, darker, before lending it shape. One witness later recalled seeing her lips moving silently in the night, whispering to shadows no one else could see. Pastor Phillips, already unraveling, wrote in his journal, "They do not predict, they recall. But from where? From when?" On that 6th night, the congregation demanded more. They begged the twins to reveal the hidden sins of Pine Hollow. "Speak," one man cried. "Tell us who is cursed among us." Rebecca's eyes glinted as she pointed to the blacksmith's wife, exposing her secret meetings with another man. Gasps, denials, then silence, because the accused fell to her knees and confessed through tears. Another woman was accused of poisoning her neighbor's well, another man, of theft. Each revelation was met with denial, until the weight of truth broke them. Confession after confession poured out long. Ike pus from a wound. It was no longer prophecy, it was judgment. The twins were not revealing fate, they were dragging the rot of the community into the light, piece by piece, stripping away the masks everyone had worn for years. Ezekiel sat with his face in his hands, trembling, his knuckles white. He muttered prayers, but no one listened. The children's voices had become scripture itself. That was when Rebecca turned her gaze on Pastor Phillips. "You," she said coldly, "write to keep your fear away, but you cannot write away what you hide." The pastor's blood turned to ice. He begged her to stop, his voice cracking, but the congregation leaned forward in unison. "Tell us," they demanded. "Tell us what he hides." Rachel's voice slipped in then, soft but sharp, like the blade of a knife. 13 years, the stone church, his blood will stain the altar. The crowd murmured, some crossing themselves, others nodding grimly as if they had already accepted it as truth. Phillips felt stripped naked before them all, his life and death no longer his own, but sealed in the words of 2 children. Later, alone, he wrote in his journal that he felt something inside him, fracture. Not just his faith, but his sense of self. He was no longer the shepherd of Pine Hollow, he was a lamb already marked for slaughter. He admitted, trembling, that a part of him wanted it to come true, because to deny them was to deny reality itself. "And now I will ask you to take the next step with me. If you've followed this far, I want you to prove it." Comment the phrase, "The veil remembers." Twice. Write it as your seal, your proof that you've crossed into this knowledge and you will not turn back. Pine Hollow had already chosen their truth. Tonight, you choose yours. The 7th night was not a gathering, it was a reckoning. Pine Hollow no longer resembled a town, but a tribunal, every man and woman waiting for the twins to reveal what they feared most. The private rot they thought buried forever. Candles burned low, shadows stretched long, and the air was heavy with anticipation. Rebecca and Rachel sat at the front, small and fragile in appearance, yet commanding more dread than the oldest judge or the harshest sheriff. Rebecca began by speaking names. Each one rang out like a bell of doom. With every name came a revelation: stolen land deeds, adulterous meetings in barns, secret debts that bled families dry. One by one, the accused broke. Denials crumbled, tears spilled, confessions came in waves. The congregation wept and trembled, not from repentance but from terror. It was no longer about salvation, it was survival. Better to confess than to have your secret laid bare by the lips of a child. But then Rachel spoke, and her words did not target the living. She described a woman long dead, her murder disguised as illness. She spoke of poison in the bread, of hands that trembled as they stirred it. The accused, a frail grandmother now stooped with age, who had once been the midwife of Pine Hollow. The old woman collapsed into sobs, confessing before all that she had killed her sister-in-law decades before, stealing her husband's affection. The town erupted into chaos. Families turned on each other. Blood ties snapped like twigs underfoot. Ezekiel, broken and frantic, shouted for silence. He begged the congregation to see his daughters as children, not as oracles. His voice cracked with despair. "They cannot control it," he cried. But no one listened. The people no longer saw him as a father. They saw him as a vessel who carried the unearthly into their midst. Pastor Phillips wrote that he watched the twins closely that night. Records. Becca's eyes burned with something that looked like triumph, while Rachel seemed consumed, as though her body was too small to contain what spoke through her. He described her hands trembling violently, her lips moving even when no words came out. He feared she was not speaking to them, but answering something no one else could hear. That night, after the church emptied into the cold, Phillips overheard 2 men outside whispering of building a pyre. They spoke of purging the girls before their knowledge consumed them all, but even in their fear, they hesitated, because the question lingered: what punishment could silence children who already spoke with the voice of inevitability? Burn them, and might the fire itself turn on Pine Hollow? Phillips admitted in his journal that he had begun to dread his own pen. Each entry felt less like a record and more like a confession, as though the very act of writing was feeding the same unseen current that flowed through the twins. He wrote that his dreams were now filled with faceless crowds chanting, their voices weaving into the same phrase over and over: "The veil remembers, the veil remembers, the veil remembers." By now, the people of Pine Hollow no longer asked if the girls were right. They asked only when their own names would be spoken. They lived each day like condemned prisoners waiting for the sentence to fall, and the twins, those pale, solemn children, were the executioners. Do you see it now? This wasn't just history, it was transformation, a tearing away of masks until nothing but raw, unbearable truth remained. And once you reach that point, there is no going back. Pine Hollow had passed that threshold, and soon they would learn what awaited on the other side. By the 8th day, Pine Hollow no longer whispered, it screamed. Neighbors refused to share meals. Families locked their doors at night, not out of fear of thieves, but of what might be revealed come morning. The twins had reduced the settlement to a raw wound, each secret cut open, each lie rotting in daylight. But here is the truth most men fear to admit. Once you taste forbidden knowledge, you crave more. Even as they trembled, the people wanted it. They wanted the blade turned toward them, desperate to know the worst of themselves. That evening, the entire town crowded into the church. It was suffocating, every pew filled, the air heavy with sweat, smoke, and dread. Rebecca stood calmly at the front, her face pale and composed. Rachel swayed beside her, feverish, her eyes darting as though she were tracking figures only she could see. Together they began to speak, not in prophecy, not in accusation, but in history. They told of Pine Hollow before Pine Hollow, of the first stones placed where the church now stood, of men in cloaks who did not worship Christ, but something older, darker, something buried in the hills. They described rituals in the woods, blood spilled into the soil, and children buried beneath the roots of trees to bind the land. Their words flowed too precise, too detailed to be the invention of children. Phillips wrote in his journal that it felt less like they were telling a story and more like they were remembering. The congregation shifted in terror. They wanted to believe it was blasphemy, imagination, but the bones beneath the altar still haunted them. They knew the girls spoke true. Some clutched their Bibles tighter, muttering prayers. Others stared at the twins with wide, feverish eyes, as if they were not children but mirrors reflecting the town's hidden lineage of sin. Then Rebecca's voice dropped to a whisper. Your prayers have never risen above the trees, they have sunk down into the soil. Rachel echoed, and something answers. The candles flickered violently, though no draught stirred the room. The crowd erupted, some shrieking, some collapsing in prayer, others accusing Ezekiel of bringing demons into their midst. Ezekiel, gaunt and broken, finally shouted what had burned in him for years. They are not mine to control. His voice cracked with grief. He confessed that from the moment they were born, from the moment his wife died in blood and storm, the twins had been different. They had spoken in their sleep as infants, voices too clear, too knowing. He had spent 9 years wandering from church to church, hoping to find one strong enough to resist them, to contain whatever force lived in them. But Pine Hollow, he realized too late, had become their stage. The people surged forward, some to touch the girls, others to strike them, but none succeeded. Rebecca only closed her eyes and smiled, as though the chaos had been expected. Rachel lifted her hand slowly and whispered, "One of you will hang before the leaves return." The crowd froze. No name given, no detail needed. The promise of death was enough to paralyze them all. Phillips later wrote that the sound of the congregation leaving that night was worse than any silence he had ever known. Hundreds of footsteps retreating into the cold, each carrying the certainty that their own doom might already be spoken, waiting only for the right night. And now, I'll ask you, what would you do if your name was next? Would you run? Would you confess? Or would you wait for children to carve your fate into stone with a whisper? Think carefully, because Pine Hollow was about to find out the cost of waiting. By the 9th day, the town was hollowed out, its spirit consumed. Work ceased entirely. No plows struck soil, no hammers rang in the forges. Men sat idle, staring at doors they no longer dared to open. Women clutched children close, not from love, but from fear that the twins' voices would tear their family apart. Pine Hollow was no longer a place of living. It had become a waiting room for judgment. That morning, the bell tolled, though no one had rung it. The people gathered anyway, drawn like moths to the flame they could not resist. Rebecca and Rachel were already inside, seated calmly in the front pew. The twins said nothing for several minutes, yet the silence was so heavy that the crowd dared not even shuffle their feet. Finally, Rebecca lifted her head and spoke. "The blood is on your hands, but the rope will choose." The words spread like wildfire. Who among them was marked to hang? Suspicion ignited like kindling. Every glance became a threat, every handshake a test of guilt. Men accused neighbors, brothers accused brothers, and still the twins sat, unmoving, letting fear do their work for them. That night, Phillips recorded in his journal what may have been his final attempt at reason. He begged the elders to send the family away, to put the girls on the road before Pine Hollow tore itself apart. But the elders refused. Some argued the twins were divine punishment that must be endured. Others whispered that they were a chance at power, a link to something beyond human reach. No one agreed, no one acted, and so the poison festered. The breaking point came when Samuel Wright was found hanging from a tree at the edge of town, his body swaying in the morning frost. No trial, no confession. The townsfolk muttered that perhaps he had chosen to end his life out of guilt, but others swore they saw men dragging him through the dark, justice carried out by trembling hands eager to satisfy the prophecy. Either way, the rope had chosen, just as Rebecca said. From that moment, the town fractured beyond repair. Some worshipped the twins openly, falling to their knees before them, demanding more revelations. Others began to whisper of fire and stones, of purging the curse before it consumed them all. Ezekiel wept openly, cradling his daughters, muttering prayers to a God who no longer seemed to answer. His once commanding presence had dissolved into something pitiful, a man watching the world unravel through the mouths of his own blood. Phillips described his own torment vividly. Dreams of stone churches cracking under thunder, of blood dripping into open Bibles, of his own name spoken by voices he could not silence. He admitted in writing that he considered leaving Pine Hollow that very night, but fear kept him bound. Fear that the moment he crossed the valley, the girls would whisper his fate aloud, and distance would offer no escape, and so Pine Hollow remained suspended between two abysses, worship and destruction. Every man and woman waited for the next revelation, knowing it would come, unable to stop it, terrified to live without it. The town was no longer a place of flesh and blood. It was a theatre of doom, its actors powerless, its script already written in the pale voices of children. Tell me, could you have withstood it? Could you have heard your neighbor's sins, your family's secrets, your own fate, and walked away untouched? Or would you, too, have leaned forward in the silence, desperate for the knife to cut you open? Because that is what Pine Hollow did. They leaned forward, and what came next carved them into history forever. The 10th and final day dawned with an unnatural stillness. The mist hung low in the valley, thicker than it should have been, as though the hills themselves were holding their breath. No birds sang, no axes rang. Pine Hollow was frozen, waiting for the inevitable. They all knew it. Even Ezekiel, who clutched his Bible like a drowning man clings to driftwood, seemed resigned. His prayers had grown hoarse, his words empty. The people no longer looked at him. Their eyes were fixed only on the children. That night, the church filled one last time. Candles sputtered, shadows swelled against the walls, and every soul in Pine Hollow gathered, trembling as though they were sheep waiting for slaughter. Rebecca stood at the altar, her small frame impossibly steady. Rachel lingered behind her, swaying as if tethered to something unseen. For a moment, there was silence. Then Rebecca spoke. "This is the last," she said. Her voice carried no emotion, only finality. The ground remembers. The blood remembers. The veil remembers. Rachel's voice joined hers, perfectly synchronized, the echo of one soul split into two. You built this place on bones, you prayed on curses, and now you must choose. The congregation erupted. Some shouted for mercy, others for fire. Some fell to their knees, begging forgiveness from sins they had not yet been accused of. But Rebecca raised her hand and the room fell silent. "There is no forgiveness," she whispered, "only truth." Then Rachel lifted her gaze and stared directly at Pastor Phillips. Her eyes burned with fever, and her lips curled into a smile that did not belong to a child. 13 years, she said again. Stone walls, an altar stained red. your voice silenced forever. The pastor collapsed, sobbing, the weight of his destiny pressing him into the floor. The people watched, horrified yet entranced, as though the prophecy itself had chained them. And then, the final act. Rebecca turned to the crowd and spoke words that Phillips wrote with a shaking hand. "This place will not stand. By morning, it will be ash." The congregation panicked. Some ran, some clutched their children and screamed, others simply froze, paralyzed by the inevitability of it. Ezekiel rushed forward, grabbed his daughters and shouted at the people to leave, to save themselves. His voice cracked with despair, but no one truly moved until Rachel whispered, "It's already begun." No one knows who struck the first flame. Some said it was an angry husband, others a fearful mother, but soon fire spread through the wooden church. Sparks leapt to the roof, smoke poured thick, and chaos consumed the night. People fled into the cold as the flames roared higher, devouring pews, beams, and finally the pulpit itself. Pastor Phillips dragged bodies from the blaze, his lungs burning, but when he turned back for the twins, he swore they were standing calmly inside, untouched by the fire, their eyes fixed on him until the roof caved in. By dawn, the church was nothing but charred ruins. Ezekiel was never seen again. Some say he perished in the flames, clutching his daughters. Others whisper he fled into the hills, carrying them into deeper exile. The people of Pine Hollow scattered soon after, families abandoned homes, the settlement fading from maps until it was as if it had never existed. Only Phillips remained, broken, haunted, scribbling the record you now hear, the record found over a century later beneath dust and rot. The twins were never recovered, no bodies, no graves, only stories. Stories of two pale children walking the ridgelines, speaking truths no one should know, their voices carried on the wind. And now, you know their story, you cannot unknow it. Pine Hollow is ash, the Morrisons vanished, but truth is eternal. It waits. It remembers. So I'll ask you one final time, what hour is it where you are? Look at the clock. Look closely, because the veil remembers, and now, so do you.